All right, I guess we'll get started. So this week we're going to talk about functions, right? You guys have written functions before. Functions in JavaScript are really not super different. However, we get a little bit more flexibility, and functions are extremely important in JavaScript. They allow us to do things like timing and stuff like that because JavaScript is asynchronous, so not everything necessarily happens at exactly when you're expecting it to, like most programming languages do. You can think of it more like if you're running two threads in a programming language, that's kind of like how JavaScript works. It does things out of order when you're least expecting it. It would be like you writing two-threaded applications that allow for either thread to be hijacked by your application. Have you guys done threading yet? No, I don't think you actually do. I don't think you ever do get to do threading in school. It's kind of more of a university computer science level kind of thing, but it is something that I recommend learning. Threading is really a very valuable thing. I myself don't do much threading, but I do forking. Forking is a bit different. It's like threading. It's a Ruby thing, though. It's a little easier than threading. But threading is something that is very cool, especially if you're developing video games and you want to maintain, the ability to allow more things to happen. And not many developers actually utilize threading when they're building video games, unfortunately. Though if they did, we would have a lot faster video games. We have these wonderful processors that do, upwards of, some processors overclocked will do 5.1 billion operations per second. That's a stupid amount. Add in the fact that there are cores, there's multiple cores. Some of them, most newer processors support up to 6 cores, right? That are at a consumer-friendly level. 6 cores, and a lot of those are hyper-threaded, which means 12 cores, so 12 times 5.1 billion operations, right? That's a stupid number of operations. Threading is very cool because it's very, very fast, right? JavaScript, even though it's a single-threaded language, it does things asynchronously as almost as if you had multiple threads that you were working with. So things don't necessarily happen in the order you're expecting that. Now, we haven't experienced that because all the code we've been writing up to this point, for the most part, the code that we've been writing up to this point is called blocking code, which means this thing has to occur in order for this thing to occur next. That's just the way we've been writing it so far. We're going to look, when we talk about APIs, that's when you're going to really feel the frustration. Because you'll reach out and go grab content from the API, and your application will continue to run. It won't wait. It won't stop and wait for the response. And then you'll get the response, and you won't be expecting it, and you'll want to try to deal with that. And many new JavaScript developers will use things like set interval or some sort of delay in order to time it out, but that's not the best way to do it. Today, we're actually going to talk a little bit about that. We're not going to actually connect to an API, but we're going to talk about something called callbacks, something we've been using quite a bit, actually. But today we're going to use it more in a structured way, and you're going to see how it kind of works. After we're done doing the function discussion, the lecture tutorial thing that we're doing today should take only about maximum 2 hours, I'm hoping. After that, I've left some time open. Instead of doing another big example, I left some time open to help with labs and assignments. Because based on the feedback that I've been getting over the weekend, I'm thinking people could use the help. I think, to be honest, we should approach the lab over the assignment. The lab is due the 7th, which is this Sunday. Actually, I extended that. I changed that because I thought it was a douchebag thing to do. Should be the 14th, yeah.
The assignment is 21st, right?
The assignment is the 21st, so it's the following week. I believe so I did it as Sunday, October 14th. And the reason why is because it's Thanksgiving this weekend. I don't need, your parents mad at you because you have to work all weekend on your lab. And to be honest with you, I'm not going to be grading it this weekend. I'll be busy. So the way I see it, we'll extend it one more week. So that gives you a little bit of a grace period. But I figure we'll talk a little bit about the lab because it does come to the weeks prior to this. We won't go over it, and I won't do it for you, but we'll talk about the things that are kind of holding people up with it. Okay? As for the assignment, I did extend the date on the assignment to the 21st. Not sure if you guys noticed that. I did announce it in Slack. It's now due on the 21st. Again, some people are having issues. One of the issues I've noticed is it's my fault. The steps inside the assignment, I didn't actually go through and build out the match game, okay? So the steps in the assignment, sometimes there's copy and paste errors, so you do have to kind of apply a little bit of logic behind what you're doing. And then the other factor is it's supposed to encompass all 6 weeks, right? So some of the things we haven't learned, which is functions, like we're going to learn today, and event binding, which we're learning next week, are needed in order to complete the assignment, right? Now, that being said, though, we have done event binding. We've done DOM crawling. We've done functions, I don't know how many bajillion times at this point. But I think not having a structured lesson around it makes it harder for you to realize and recognize that that's what we're building. So we're going to have a structured lesson today around that. So why don't we get started? If we go to week 5, go to the starter for library functions, and yank that file down. How many people are doing the weekly reading? Just ballpark out of curiosity? Okay. Is it helpful or not really? Not really? It's dry, isn't it?
Yeah, it's dry.
Yeah.
I think so. A lot of the basics we're used to from Java and C# already.
Oh, is it?
So we're used to like arrays and like forms and stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
But you don't actually get to see it in a JavaScript context, so to speak.
Yeah.
Like it should be showing it to you in a JavaScript context,
Yeah.
but yeah, unless you do like the whole example and go through that whole process, yeah. All right, let's shove this over to the right-hand
it'll be more
side.
helpful as we get into like more like JavaScript specific stuff.
Yes, it will be,
Yeah.
especially when we do things like event bindings and stuff like that, or get into prototypal.
The element of JavaScript's indicating in spots, and then it goes super dry, and then it gets back to like being and I was just like, this is 2 people writing this. This is 2 people writing this.
Wait until you get to like C++. I think it's an optional course for you guys. I don't think you're required to take C++. But C++ is extremely dry. And it's made worse if you buy the Bjorn Strusup book, the guy that wrote C++. It's just, I don't know. His good time is a dry martini with some dry crackers, I think. That's his good time. And writing very dry books. But yeah, it can be painful. What's that?
So don't take that class.
So don't take that class? I don't know. Like, I would say if you're really into programming, take that class. It's worthwhile because it's like everything, kind of like, many languages based off Latin. Like so many languages based off Latin.
Nobody learns Latin.
I know, which is ridiculous because if you learn Latin, learning other languages becomes so much easier because you can see like the little grounding blocks. That's C++ in a nutshell. C++ is like learning Latin in order to learn other languages. If you understand C++, but then there's limitations. Because you're like, I can do all this cool stuff in C++ because you literally can do whatever you want. Like, it's not restrictive, right? You can access points of memory and like shove whatever the hell you want in those points of memory directly. You can access specific cores on your processor. Like, there's a lot of control. But you can't do that in other languages because they restrict all that and they hide it from you and make it obscure, right? So it's cool and it can be frustrating. If you want to do game development, definitely take C++. Yeah, 100%. If you want to do game development, take C++. I had a few students actually build games in that class, which was pretty cool, using OpenGL. All right, so I've got your HTML file. I'm going to talk a little bit about this as well, just because I think there's been some issues with HTML. When did you guys take HTML? Semester 1?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's been like a full almost year in between when you took it.
Exactly.
All right, so you understand the basic structure of HTML, like the HTML block, right? The head tag and the body tag. Believe it or not, the only element that you are required for valid WC3 HTML is the body element and the HTML element. You're not even required the head tag. We use the head tag, though, because the head tag provides the browser some key information about your document, right? One, it tells you whatever style sheets you want to use or apply, right? That's where all those go. It says, hey, you need to load all these things up. And I'm not sure if Scott or whoever you had for HTML explained this, but these style sheets, if anything causes them to hang, the whole page hangs until they're done, right? They don't load asynchronously. They're not like loading in the background. They load when they load. and then the rest of your page loads. That's kind of the reason why we haven't been putting JavaScript in the head. By putting JavaScript down here, we're guaranteed that the HTML page has loaded before we start to execute scripts. That's a very common practice. You're going to see that all the time unless you're applying Google Analytics, which for some reason wants to be in the head. So you have to make sure it's in the head. There are ways to lazy load it though. So I've included some third-party pieces, and I'm pulling them from the Bootstrap CDN network. I'm just going to make this a little bigger so you can see what's going on. The first one I'm loading in is just Bootstrap, right? Bootstrap is a framework that you use for doing styling. I recommend using Bootstrap unless you want to do your own styling. Bootstrap makes things a lot simpler. It's not 100% though, right? And it has its own opinions. And in full honesty, Bootstrap was never meant to be a design tool. That was never its purpose. Bootstrap was built by the Twitter team because they were sick of programmers giving them shit. They were saying, you know what, your prototypes are unusable, they look like garbage, and it's distracting. Figure out something. So then they brought in a design team who built out Twitter Bootstrap, and they said, cool, now apply this to any prototype you make so it doesn't look like garbage. That was its whole purpose. It was never meant to be this thing that is now used everywhere. Like, how many of you honestly can recognize Bootstrap the second you see it on a page? Yeah, it's instant. It's the roundness of the buttons. It's locations of things. It's like WordPress. I can almost every single time, I'd say about 90% of the time, I can tell you if it's a WordPress site. Because again, it's the layout. It's the way it's structured. There's just something about it that screams WordPress. The next CSS library I'm adding is Font Awesome. Font Awesome is awesome. Font Awesome provides you little icons. There's about 300 plus icons. If you buy it, there's like almost 1,000 plus icons. They basically give you nice flat designed icons that you can use on your page for like social media links, or, you know, like if you want to build an edit button, they have a pencil and stuff like that. It just makes it easy instead of you having to build your own SVGs or your own PNGs or whatever. Font Awesome is very, very, very cool tool. So I would definitely recommend bookmarking your Font Awesome CDN. We have Jquery. The only reason we have Jquery is because Bootstrap requires it. If we want to do modals, popovers, or anything like that, it requires Jquery, though I do believe for Bootstrap 5, they're trying to take the Jquery component out entirely, and it'll be written in vanilla.
Have they finished Bootstrap 4?
Yeah, Bootstrap 4 is done. It's not in alpha, and it's definitely not in beta.
No, it's out.
It's been out for at least 3 years. Yeah, they're on 4.1, so they are like past beta now. Yeah. If you're ever looking on how to use Bootstrap, your address that you want to remember and commit to memory is getbootstrap.com. Documentation's there, how to add it, everything else. I use CDNs. There is an issue with using CDNs. If you don't have intranet, they do not work. So sometimes pulling the libraries down is a little better, especially if you're locally developing and you have sketchy internet. It's probably not a bad idea to pull the libraries down. All right. The last one is the Bootstrap JavaScript, which is basically it adds components onto the jQuery library and allows you to do things like popovers and modals and a whole bunch of different things. Slide ups, tabs, a bunch of different things that require JavaScript. And then last but not least, we load in our external main.js. And this is the thing that we've been doing from week to week. I usually type it out for you because, you know, that's not really hard to remember, right? It's just the main.js file. For those of you that have difficulty with your file structure directory, if I don't have a slash and something else in front of there, I'm reading from the root directory. That's what that basically means. So it's immediately reading from the root directory. What you may see people do on occasion is add /. That's the same. It's still reading from the root directory. It's reading from the directory it's currently located in. Okay? But I kind of like the cleanliness of just main. And then we have our external style sheet as well. Though that is, yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's our external style sheet. The page breaks down once we get into, sorry, we also have title. Why don't we add a title? We'll call it library functions. And then I'm just going to open it up inside Chrome so I can see it. Yeah. Cool. And if you load it up, that's what you should see. I've got some styling. We'll talk about the styling in a few minutes. But if you did your title correctly, the tab will change to library functions. That's what's changing. Yeah, man. Sorry?
Get rid of the top like that.
This thing?
Yeah, don't please don't.
I'm just going to hit random buttons and we'll see what happens. That's not the right one. Totally the opposite of what you want. Two things. Oh, is it that side? Let's just develop in the dark. Just kill them.
Yeah.
Yeah, to me, red means off, not on. Like, I don't know.
This is like, we're green because we're saving energy.
That's like people that install light switches upside down, and you go into their house, and you're like,
You're like,
why am I flicking up to turn it off? It doesn't make any sense. Yeah. All right, so anyways, library functions. I need to increase this font size because I imagine you cannot read this. Library functions should be your title because that's basically what we're saying. The head is saying, hey, this title is this thing right up here. Now, you can also add favicons and all that type of stuff. And at some point, if we have time, I'll show you how to add a favicon. At work, we use a favicon generator. We literally just throw a PNG into it, and it spits out a whole slew of favicons, and then we dump them into the file, right? Like, it takes seconds. Our body is important, right? Because that's what the document builds itself with. It takes a look at those body tags, and the things that are inside that body tag is what gets spit out to the document, providing they are renderable. Renderables are like your div tags, your section elements, HTML elements, anything that basically takes text or value is a renderable. Script tags are not renderable. Template tags are not renderable. Inline CSS tags are not renderable. Those are things that don't render by the browser. The renderables we have in here currently are our container element, which is a Bootstrap thing. We have two boxes, box 1, box 2, with a P1 and a P2 tag on it. We have a starting line and a finish line, and then we have a button called Go, so I think it's pretty transparent what we're going to build here. All right? So we'll hook all that up with our JavaScript, but before we do that, why don't we just take a quick look at the CSS. I take advantage of these lessons to challenge myself to learn something newer for me. Like I said before, I'm kind of crappy at CSS. I've never been very strong with CSS. So when I build these out, I try to practice my CSS and do something a little bit more off-key. So this time I'm using position elements. Position does something kind of cool. Position absolute actually takes the DOM element out of the page's context and allows you to move it around the page wherever you want. Most times, by default, everything works in a cascading order. Right? So normally, if I was to look at the HTML here, normally box 1 would be above box 2, start would be below that, and finish would be below that. Button is an inline element, but because div is a block element, it'll be below that. So in order to move things around where I want them to go, I use a lot of position absolute. And then I just tell it exactly where I want it to be. So for example, I say left 10 pixels, which means start 10 pixels in. Top 10 pixels, start at least 10 pixels down. Make yourself 60 pixels wide. Make your height 60 pixels tall, so it's a square. That's the color element is the text that's inside the block. And then I do some font stuff, and then I'm also using display flex. Display flex allows me to align elements inside an element, which I'm doing in here. That's why the P1 is in the dead center, and the P2 is dead center. Then I color the two backgrounds. That's the color of the first block. That is the color of the second block. Plus I move it down by 80 pixels. CSS is not super difficult, and if you actually kind of read it, you can kind of get a clue of what it's doing. But it's definitely something that If you struggle with CSS, I would take a look at W3 Schools, though I'm not a big fan of it. W3 Schools is a good place to start for learning things like CSS, just in case you do need a refresher. The big things that I would be learning right now, if I was you guys, was Flexbox, 100%, right? And CSS Grid, because CSS Grid is becoming a big, massive thing, and a lot of people want to use it. Those are the two that I would look at. Other than that, take a look at these style sheets and break them. Do things that break them. Change values, change things. First start with the things that you recognize, like the colors, change them out. Just do things to see what happens, and that's probably the best way to learn. All right? All right, cool. Let's move on to what the class is about. Open up main.js. And we'll start with functions. The first functions we're going to start with is the one that I think every class that teaches functions starts with, is the built-in functions, right? The library-based functions. And JavaScript has a whole slew of them, but not many are actually global. Every global function we're going to look at is actually a part of the window element. So there's an object that you don't really interact with 100% of the time. It's called window. And window has a whole slew of methods attached to them. However, if you call them without the window dot, you can actually call them like you would call any normal function, right? So, but just keep in mind that all these functions we're about to call are technically methods, right? You guys know the difference between a method and a function? No? What's that? No, that's also modules versus functions, right? Modules don't return values, functions return values, but they're still functional hierarchy structures. Same as methods versus functions. The syntax is still the same. The difference is a method lives inside an object, right? It's a part of the object. Methods are actionables. They're things that an object has capable of doing. Properties are describing things about that object, right? We'll talk more about that when we get into objects. We actually look at object programming. Functions, for the most part, are just like a global block of text, global block of expressions, usually, that you've encapsulated in a repeatable block. It's something that you can call whenever you want, right? So that you don't have to write that whole block of text over and over and over again. Functions are fantastic. We use functions all the time. Once you start object-oriented programming, yes, you write methods more than you'll write functions, but they're not something that you'll just walk away from entirely. You will still need them, especially when you're trying to like pull your objects out and stuff. All right, so why don't we write a function? First, we're going to take a look at one of the functions that are built in called cast string to a number. We've used this once before. In JavaScript, we have two data types, right? Strings, numbers, that's it. We don't have, well, we have tons of data types, but those are the two like data types, right? Numbers and strings. Let's create a variable called letString2num. That's the name of our variable. Okay. And we'll assign it the string of 256. Now that's a string. That's technically not a number. Even though JavaScript will allow us to multiply it, allow us to divide it, use modulus or subtraction, where it fails is when we try to add to it, right? Because it's like, dude, that's a string. We're just going to concatenate anything you try to add on to this. We're going to treat it as a string. If I want to make it so it's not a string, and this is an important concept to understand because everything from this guy over here comes to this guy as a string, right? Any input that is on this page inside the HTML will come back to us as a string. So we need to know how to convert it if we want to maintain normalization and sanitization and consistency. And the way we do that is we use the global, and you can call this in two different ways. You can either call it window.number, or we can just call it globally number, like so. And what that does is it takes the string value inside and casts it out to a number. We can see that if we call console.log and we use an operator called typeof, and we pass it our string to num. And if you refresh your browser, whoops, wrong side, it should say number. Now we also have the opposite to that as well. Let's create another variable. Sorry, let num to string equal, if I can find the equal sign, 67. And if I want to cast that, there's two different ways I can cast that. Either I can call toString on it, or I can use the global method string and wrap it. And then we can spit that out to the console. Type of num to string. And if you refresh, you'll see that it's a string. And those are really only the cast things that you need currently, right? Be able to convert to a number, be able to convert to a string, back and forth. That's really it. Those are both global methods available on the window object. If you want to know what objects you have available, what functions are globally available, what properties are globally available, you can check by typing window into your console. And when you type it, you get that handy little arrow, right? And if you click the arrow, it might take like half a second to load because there's a whole whack of methods and properties available there. All the methods available are with the F, though this $ is not being provided by the window object. Does anybody know what's providing that $?
Jquery.
Yeah, Jquery. Jquery's added its own little $sign to this window object. But there's a ton of other ones. There's caches, there's the cancel animation frame, clear interval, clear timeout. Some of these we're going to look at today. There's properties about the window, like such as its inner height and its inner width. It's telling us right now our window is 280 pixels. I don't know if it'll change. Yeah, it's not dynamic. We'd have to call window again to see the change. We have the Jquery object that was added to the window. The navigation object, which is about your actual browser's details. So it's like what browser you're using, information about that browser is all hidden underneath the navigator. All of your click events, every single event that's available on window, and window, just like any other object inside the JavaScript, has a ton of click events and other events, drag, scroll, and those become important too. Like you guys have been on pages before where you scroll and the background moves slightly slower than the foreground. It's called parallax, right? That's usually done. You can do it with just CSS, but it's very difficult. But you can do it very easily with JavaScript, right? JavaScript tends to do that, and that's based on the onScroll event, which if you scroll down, is right there, onScroll. All right? There's tons of different pieces in here. It's a very handy thing. If you haven't been using the console up to this point, I definitely recommend using it because it gives you a lot of valuable information. All right, step 2, browser prompt functions. We wrote these last week. It looks like they are currently in there. We'll just type it out underneath. So the first one is alert. Alert basically just informs the user some piece of information you want them to know. I'm going to save it. If I refresh, the browser jumps to attention and says, "Welcome to the game." And then we can click OK to dismiss it. Somebody asked me last week, do we have control over styling that? And the answer is no. The browser controls that window. It controls that piece. You don't have any direct control over those little blurbs that show up, whether you use alert, prompt, or confirm, or the download window, for that matter. Those are browser-based pieces. You don't have control over those. All right. The next one is the confirmation. So we'll write that. Let confirmation equal confirm. Do you like the game? And then we'll console log the response. First we'll do type of confirmation, and then confirmation. Confirm is our way of being able to get a little piece of information from our user using the browser's built-in alert box. We essentially can say to the user, hey, do you agree with this thing or not? It's always a Boolean question, so it only returns a Boolean value. We're either going to get true or we're going to get false. We get true if they click the affirmation link, which is okay, or we get false if they click cancel, okay? So if we refresh, one second, Alan. If we refresh, we get welcome to the game. Then we get, this page says, do you like the game? If we click cancel, you can see that we spit out the Boolean of false. Yeah.
Is that what is going on with web pages now that they came up with those new laws in the UK?
For the GDBP or whatever it's called?
Yeah.
I think that's the first time I've ever said it correctly. Yeah, the GDBP. Yeah.
And it's like this site uses good for blah, and you always like.
So that's a bit different. They're not using the built-in browser piece. They're throwing up like a little modal on the bottom of the footer. You click OK, they register that into the database, and they assign a cookie to your website, to your browser, saying, hey, you agreed to this thing. That's why if you clear your cookies and go back to the same site, you'll get the same message again. Yeah. I don't know what that's about. I don't know if that might be the GDBP, but they've been doing that for a few years now before that came out. For those of you who don't know what the GDBP is, in Europe they announced that a user's information, if you are storing any information about that user, you must be completely transparent with the user and they have to know. But it extends a little further. If they require you to remove their information, you have to purge it from your system. Every single piece of information that relates to that user, their passwords, their email addresses, how they've been using the system, if it connects to them in any way, any analytical data that connects to them in any way, must be completely purged. Unless it's anonymous data, you have to get rid of it. So companies like Amazon and Google and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram obviously were massively affected. Not so much like your home-based, web design shops, though some of them were, like we were, with our distributor's site, because our distributor site will be providing service out to other countries. We had to consider GDBP when we were building our site. That's why we created something called a snapshot table, which allows us to snapshot data that doesn't relate to the user but is important for reporting, right? But it doesn't have any information of the user in it. But yeah, that's GDBP. All right, we have one more. We have a prompt. So we'll go let response equals prompt. And a prompt allows us to collect information that is not Boolean. How often do you play games? And then we can console.log, type of response, response.
Why is response written twice and why is it written twice?
Where are you looking? Right here? One is because type of is an operator, just like plus or minus or anything. If I put type of in front of the variable, the return that I'm going to get from this expression is the data type. I'm not going to get the value. Whereas this piece is the value. So when I go comma, this is a list. You can provide console.log a list of things you want to spit out to the console. So I'm saying I want to know the type of confirmation and I want to know the value of confirmation. Same with the response, doing the same thing. Does anybody know what the type of response will be?
String.
Yeah, it'll be a string. So if I click refresh on my browser, I get welcome to the game. Do you like the game? I'm going to say OK this time, and now we get Boolean true. How often do you play games? If I hit cancel, I will get an object back and I will get null, okay? Which is, hold on to this, because this is where things like this are not reliable. If I click refresh, go through this process again, but this time I say 9. We'll just say 9, and I click OK. I get string 9. So as a programmer, that becomes a little bit more difficult for you because one is an object and one is a string. It's not necessarily reliable, right? That's why we generally don't use alert, confirm, or prompt. We use confirm when we want to delete things. That's basically the only time we use confirm. Alert is extremely rare. Some websites actually block alert from being used at all. So you can't even actually access the alert box. And some block prompt as well. So let's let's do step 2D so we're not completely annoyed. Comment out the above code to avoid it calling each time, right? Because every time we load this browser, it's going to call. So I'm just going to comment out these pieces by adding double slashes in front of each one, just up to alert. Then if I refresh my browser, they all disappear. All right, let's talk about step 3. Step 3, so there's some parsing functions that are built into JavaScript. Interestingly enough, I don't use very many of these. The only one I really ever use is JSON parsing. Other than that, I've never used these before, but they do exist. So the first one is parsing a float. So if I say let float equal 3.14, and I say float is equal to parse float, and pass it our variable. And then I console.log that out. And again, I'm going to use type of, float, and also float as part of my list that I'm going to display. If I refresh, of course, I'm going to get 3.14, and it's going to tell me that it's a number, right? Because it is. Now, you may be asking, what's the point of that? We have number casting, right? We can just use number to cast. What is the point of parsing float? Well, float parse does a few other things that make it a little bit cooler. Like, for example, we can tell if it's not a number specifically. So if I say float is equal to, I have 3.14 things, and then I say float is equal to parse float, console.log float. And of course, you're welcome to copy and paste. I tend to find that I type faster than I copy and paste. You'll notice that now we get number nan. And the reason is because it's saying I have 3.14 things is not a number. Uniquely enough, the way parse float works is it starts at the beginning. It takes whatever numbers are located at the beginning of the string, parses those, and then will terminate at the first character that shows up that is alphanumeric, or sorry, alpha, and not numeric, okay? And we can demonstrate that. Let's resolve that. So if I said 3.14 things instead of I have, right? Float is equal to parse float, passive float, console.log, type of float, and float. And refresh, we get 3.14. So it's kind of handy if you know the number is at the beginning of your string, or you can break in a number and then just quickly parse that back instead of just having to run like regular expression or anything to grab what you're looking for. Even though I'm sure parse float under the hood is running regular expression. You figure it'd be a little bit more versatile than that, though. We can do the same thing with integers. I'm not going to show all 3 steps. I'll just show the first step. Let's create an integer. Call it 3.14. I know that's not an integer. Integer, parse int, pass it integer. Integer. And then we'll just console log out type of integer and integer. And then refresh. Oops. Parse. Oh, yeah, helps if you, helps if we have the assignment. There we go. And we get the number 3. So 0.14 gets completely truncated. Right? It's not rounding. It's very important to understand that. It is not rounding. What's that?
Cuts it off at the decimal.
Literally just cuts it right off at the decimal. Yeah. It's not flooring, it's not ceiling, it's not rounding. It treats it as though it doesn't exist. Yeah.
What's the use of parse function?
The user
What's the use of this function?
for parse int?
Yeah.
I guess that, exactly. If you wanted to use it like an absolute function, you could use it as an absolute instead of loading the math library in and using the math library to do it. Might be a bit quicker for that sort of thing. Not a heck of a lot, to be honest with you. Like, to be quite transparent, this is the first time I've used parse float and parse int ever. So yeah, like I said, I use JSON parsing all the time because I'm constantly parsing between moving JSON from the server to the browser and back and forth. So I use that all the time. But these, yeah, never. I just load the math library. Might not be the most efficient way, but yeah, that's what I do. All right, so we're going to ignore step 3E and step 3F, and we're going to move to step 4. We're going to talk about the number verification. The number verification, there's two of them. There's isNan, which basically is a way of checking to see whether whatever it is that you're evaluating is not a number. And then there's also isFinite, which means not infinity. All right, so we'll show you how that works. We can say let, we'll call it nanny, equals 3.14 things. And that's quite obviously not a number. So if I say nanny is equal to isNan, nanny, and then console.logout nanny. I'm going to say type of nanny and nanny, and refresh. We will get it's a Boolean and it's true. The important thing to understand what isNan is doing, isNan is a comparison. Okay, it does a comparison to check to see whether or not what it's evaluating is a number, so its value that it will always return will be a Boolean. Same with isFinite. isFinite works the same way. It just checks to see if what is currently inside its parameters as its argument is finite, or is it infinity? Is it always going to just go on for infinity? isNan is not something I've used often. I have used it, though, of course, the example completely eludes me right now. But finite is something that is a little bit more common because when you're dealing with dynamic data, it is not uncommon to wind up with somebody giving you a 0 and you dividing by 0 accidentally. Does anybody know what happens when you divide by 0? It just goes for infinity, actually. It goes for infinity in computer world. So you can check that. You can say finite equals isFinite, which allows you to evaluate it. In some languages, some would say in better languages, division by 0 should throw an error, right? In most languages it will. In most languages it will throw an error. In JavaScript it does not. But it does tell you, if you run the isFinite method on it, it does tell you that no, this is not finite. This will go for infinity. Which makes sense, right? You can divide 0 into something an infinite amount of times. In the real world, I can take 0 things and divide it into something infinite number of times. That's what JavaScript is saying to us. You can do this an infinite number of times. In the computer world, you're completely correct. This is garbage. Don't do this. It's what it's saying in the real world. Most languages will blow up. They'll completely blow up and tell you that is not available. You can't do that. Ruby, PHP, C++, they all blow up, guaranteed. Python blows up too. But in JavaScript, nope, you can divide 3 by 0.
What's the result?
I don't know, actually. Let's console.log that. That's a very good question. Infinity.
So still, infinity means not defined. Well, means
No, it's not.
Let's check that.
Undefinedness.
Let's see if you're correct.
Infinity
Undefined
synonyms with undefined.
is equal to infinity. According to JavaScript, you are false.
JavaScript doesn't know nothing. Undefined means infinite.
Well, undefined means undefined.
Which is the same as infinite. It means it does not end, it doesn't have a definition.
It doesn't have a definition. Yeah. All right, we also have eval. Eval is the evil eval, right? You guys have probably heard that, just like globals are evil. Eval is not necessarily evil if you're controlling the input, right? Eval is evil if you're not controlling the input. If you're taking user data and then just running eval on it, well, bad. Stop doing that. so you understand what eval does, eval is a method that takes a string as an argument. The string will be parsed as JavaScript expressions. So you can give it whatever you want, and it will parse that as a JavaScript expression. Okay? You can see the dangers of that. There's a lot of dangers when it comes to that. One, it's also slow. It's dangerous and it's slow. It's extremely slow. The danger comes into play of when eval runs, it runs under the user's credentials, their browser credentials, as them, as if they themselves were executing the code within the console, right? So when you're running as the user and you're using eval and you're using it in this method, you are essentially giving a hacker the ability to use their credentials to do whatever it is that you want them to do through JavaScript manipulation. So eval is considered not a good thing to do unless you are controlling the input. So there's a whole video on eval, on the good parts of eval, which you guys can watch if you ever want to, or not, totally up to you. But let's write a little story here. So eval console.log. We'll put some quotes in here. Hello, I am the evil eval, who will allow parsing of strings as code, exclamation mark. I am slow and can be very dangerous, as I run on the user's, apostrophe S, let's escape that shit, user's machine using their privileges. Do not use me when parsing user input. Do not use me to execute third-party scripts. Want to see it run? Badoo. It's executing console.log and spitting out all our information. That's a very lightweight way to use it. Is it this class that asked me if we could use destructuring dynamically? Or was that Thursday's class? Somebody asked me if we could use destructuring dynamically. I found a way to do it with eval. Took a few seconds to figure out. Destructuring is the ability to take a list, like an array, and then assign it to a list of variables. It will take each element inside the array and assign it to each element inside the variable list until it runs out of one or the other. So we're going to say my dyn_vars, my dynamic variables. Going to create some values, 1, 4, 7, and 9 in this scenario. Then I'm going to dynamically create a list of variables. Only they're not going to look like variables quite yet. I'm going to say let I equals 0. If I is less than values.length, I plus plus. Then I'm going to call my dyn_vars and push those on using dirty backticks. Okay. So my logic, I'm creating an array, an empty array, right? The next is just a list of values, just an array of values, 4 values, 1, 4, 7, 9, right? The loop, all it's doing is iterating the number of values. So I have 4 values, so it will iterate 4 times. And then it pushes on a string called I and whatever the number is, right? So the first one will be I0, and then it'll be I1, I2, I3, right? Each one. Then I'm going to take that list. I'm going to write, using backticks, I'm going to create a string, var $, like so, equals, same thing on this side, like so. Those are my structures that I'm going to create. This is still just a string. I'm just using backticks to do string interpolation. In the first string, I'm going to say my dyn_vars dot to string And what that's going to do is it's going to take the array of dynamic variables and it's going to cast a string on them, separating each variable string by commas. I'm going to have a string of comma-separated things. That's it. On the other side, I'm going to say values dot to string as well. And whammo blammo, I now have I0, I1, I2, I3 as dynamically created variables. There's 1479. I just use eval to create dynamic variables. Something that JavaScript doesn't have built in. PHP has dynamic variables. Many languages have dynamic variables, but not JavaScript, not by default. As this is written, this is secure because I'm not taking input from the user. I'm not loading input from a third party or anything like that. That is a perfectly valid use case. I don't know, it's not very practical, but demonstrates something. How many of you have had experience with eval before? Or used eval? Or have heard of eval? Really? Exists in many languages. A lot of languages have eval. It's just so frowned upon, it's not likely you've heard of it. That's probably why. Because it's frowned upon and most people won't explore it, but it's not something to be afraid of if you use it correctly. All right, why don't we create the box racing on this side? And this kind of leads into some other pieces. We're going to talk about the DOM and event binding next week. But I want to actually select an element on my HTML page. Remember how I had those divs with the ID box 1 and box 2? I want to select both those elements and store them. When I say that in the assignment or in the lab, select a DOM element and store it, what I mean is use document query selector, select the DOM element, and then store it in a variable. That's basically what I mean. So we're going to do that. So this is document.query selector. Okay? And then I pass it, whoa, that was crazy. Then I pass it the CSS, and I can't stress that enough, the CSS selector in order to grab the DOM element. And now I'm taking, that will return back undefined if I can't find it, right? I will get back an undefined object, or I will get back an HTML element, that's its object's name, which has a whole bunch of stuff on it, different properties like length and create and query and stuff like that. But it returns back something that I can now work with. Let's just duplicate that line, change the word box1 to box2. So you should have 2 in total. And now we have 2 selected items off our HTML page. Step 6b, let's set the starting position. I'm just going to create a variable called pos, short for position, and make it equal to 0. I'm going to close off my comment so we can actually see the start. Step 6c, define the finish line. All right. Const finish equals, and again, we're just going to select the finish line. The reason why I'm selecting it is because I want to know when our boxes have crossed it. All right. Makes sense from a logic standpoint. If you're in a race, you kind of want to know when people have completed it. Step 6d, I'm going to create a random acceleration function just using normal functions syntax. Function accelerate, I'm going to say. And yes, for you math geniuses, this is probably not the way this is done. Let speed equal math.round. Math.random, we're going to create random acceleration. And we're going to round it to 2 places. And then I'm going to return the speed. This is a bit impromptu, but how could I tighten that function up a bit? So it's not so many lines. I don't need that many lines.
We just say return speed equals math dot. Sort of.
I think you're on the right track.
Or yeah, just
Yeah.
We can just return our equation.
Yep.
Right? We don't need to set a variable. We don't need to do any of that. We can just return the equation outright. Go from 5 lines to 3 lines. Whoops. Delete, delete, delete. There we go. Create a function to trigger the race. Sounds good to me. Function, start race. Using intervals, loop through every 30 milliseconds. So a built-in function into the window object, a built-in method of the window object is intervals. Intervals are fantastic. Intervals will execute a block of code every set number of milliseconds that you tell it to. So some people, when they develop video games in JavaScript, they'll use intervals in order to iterate every, 1,000 milliseconds divided by whatever number of frames you want, essentially, right? And then that produces the number of frames per ray. There's a much better method than that, and it's called animation frame that's built into the window object. It's better for this sort of thing, but we can use intervals to kind of accomplish what we want to do. So we're going to use intervals to basically loop through this whole content over and over again and move our blocks towards the end of the line animated. All right, so let's do the first one. Using intervals, loop through every 30 milliseconds. All right, so var interval ID equals set interval. Set interval takes 2 arguments. The first argument is the function you want to execute, and the function definition you want to execute, and the second argument is the number of milliseconds. The difference between a function definition and a function call are the set of parentheses. If you add the parentheses to the end of the function, that's calling that function. It will execute that function. Okay, it will invoke it, whatever word you want me to use. Right? If you don't add those parentheses, you are literally passing the block of text that is used to create that function. The definition, essentially. You pass the definition to the set interval. What set interval will do under the hood is it will actually execute that function definition when it's ready. Every however many milliseconds you tell it to, which will be 30 in this scenario, every 30 milliseconds it's going to execute that block of function. We're going to use something called an anonymous function. And don't get nervous because the next portion of this lesson we're actually going to take a look at anonymous functions in depth. We're going to use an anonymous function, which is really just a function that encapsulates some expressions but doesn't have a symbol name, right? We're not giving it any symbol name. Let's delete the closing parentheses and the closing bracket. Step 6G, for each box. All right, so for let box of, and then we'll just nest an array called box1 and box2. Whoops. Box1 and box2 are coming from up here. Right? We learned this loop last week, the of loop. What does the of loop do? Anybody remember? It's a loop, yeah. It's like a for each. It's essentially a for each. Basically what it does is it iterates through the array, takes the element off the array and assigns it to this throwaway variable we call box. Right? Now that becomes available to us within our code block beneath it, and we can access it and do whatever we want with it. Once it's done, it will go through the array again. And it will do that for however many number of elements that we want to work with. What's it called if we wanted to do that through object keys? Instead of for of, it's for for in. Yeah, that's okay. We're going to use it quite a bit when we do objects. All right, step 6H, check the box offset. If box dot offset left offset left is a property of HTML elements. On our page, we have all these different HTML elements. I want to know the distance from the edge of the window to where the box starts. That's my offset left. Don't worry if you don't remember that.
Is that related to stuff like offset height?
Yep, offset height is another one. Yep.
Okay.
And we're going to do that based on being less than finished offset left. Kind of a very ghetto collision detection. Very ghetto collision detection.
They're in the same place.
Yeah, as long as they're around the same area, we've likely hit the finish line. Full on, in the face. All right, step 6i, increase the position. Well, that makes sense, right? We want to move the block. And we're going to increase it by using our accelerate function that we created. Accelerate is essentially just going to move a set number of pixels. Each time we go through, we're going to move that set number of pixels. And we're going to keep moving the block that set number of pixels. But it's variable acceleration, so it goes up and down, up and down. So potentially either block 1 could win or block 2 could win. We don't know until we run it. Box.style.left. I was talking to somebody about this earlier. That's a way for us to access the CSS of box. We're accessing its style, and then we just call left, which happens to be a style property that's on box. Use some dirty backticks, right? You guys getting used to the dirty backticks? Starting to like them? Don't hate them? All right. Offset left. And obviously, we don't want just offset left, otherwise we would stand still and not move. We want to add the position. And the reason why we're using the backticks is because we need to add px to the end so that we give it some sort of unit, right? So styles, that's the way they work. If you give styles left equals 0, that doesn't mean anything. If you give it left equals 5, that doesn't mean anything. If you say 5 pixels, now it knows you want to move 5 pixels left. If you say 5 ems, now it knows that you want to move 50 plus 30, 80 pixels to the left, likely. Or however big your EM happens to be. All right. Step 6K. Otherwise, well, that sounds suspiciously like an else statement. Else. Else, set the second player to lose. So that means, so the first thing basically says, hey, if you are less than the finish line, do these steps. Otherwise, somebody's done, right? So if that's the case, then we're going to say box.textContent equals you lost. Sorry, Pony Boy. Now, what will happen if I don't do this next step? Our set interval will just keep executing. Every 30 milliseconds, it's going to keep running. So in order to get it to stop, I'm going to tell it to clear interval. And I pass it an argument. Does anybody want to take a guess on what argument I'm going to pass it? We kind of said it earlier. It's on line 122. No? It's even hinting at it, actually. Interval ID. So when we set interval, we can capture the ID that the DOM or the browser has assigned to set interval. And then we can use that to clear it at any point throughout. And last but not least, I want to break from our actual loop, our for loop. Otherwise, it'll iterate and do the next box. We're almost completely finished with this. We need to close some stuff out. First thing we need to close is the actual set interval function. We use a closing parenthesis and a closing curly brace and a closing parenthesis. But remember how I said set interval takes 2 arguments. The first argument is the function. What is the second argument?
The time.
Yep, the time. And it's in milliseconds. So we're going to pass it 30. Okay? How many milliseconds are in a second? 1,000. Then we're ready to close the function. Closing parenthesis. There we go. We're almost ready to race. I think I'm missing one parenthesis. Yes, I am. On line just after 139, after the break statement, I'm missing a parenthesis. Or sorry, curly brace. There we go. Should be 4 of them. One for the if condition, if else, one for the for loop, one for the set interval, and then the last one for the function. Almost done, and then we'll take a break. So under index.html, how many people need me to leave that there for a minute? Yep, okay, I'll give you a few more seconds here. For the rest of you, if you go to index.html and take a look at the button, you'll see an attribute on there called onClick. The onClick has a function that's listed there. What's the name of that function? Start race. That's going to call the start race function that we just defined here. That's a click event. We've done it several different ways, right? We've done onClick inside JavaScript where we set a variable .onClick, right? We've done it that way. And we've also done the .add event listener. This is another way to add click events. This one's a little less common, mostly because of scalability issues. When you add on-click events inside your HTML, it makes it harder to scale at some point because you now have a disassociation with your JavaScript and you won't necessarily remember what you did. If you ever change the function name or anything like that inside the JavaScript file, then obviously you just created a disconnect between your HTML and the JavaScript. It all goes down to that whole factor. HTML and HTML, JavaScript and JavaScript, right? Try not to mix these two worlds together too much. Modularity makes things a lot easier. Are we ready to move? Yes? No? Yes? Okay, let's try it. So if I refresh, I'm going to refresh twice and click go. P11. The only thing this needs is bedding. See, I think there's a glitch. Come on, P2. P21. It's probably the lousiest race logic you've ever seen. When I was in university, we had a 40-hour sprint. You have 40 hours to complete a project. And they do it during reading week, which is like literally the most masochist thing you could ever do to people. Anyway, so we had 40 hours to complete a project, so we made geometry racers. What it was just like this. We found this like track in Unity that was like a free asset, and it looked like crystal real. There was like a little lake, and there was like the track had like beautiful pavement on it, and the trees looked kind of realistic and everything. And then we slammed down a block, a cylinder, and a sphere, and we mapped flames on them and headlights, and we called it geometry racers. They had drifting. We could drift around corners with them and stuff. It was shit, but you could drift around corners. It was the best game ever. Anyways, this is my ode to that. This is my geometry racers. All right. Why don't we take a break for a little bit, and then when we get back, we'll learn how to make our own functions, which probably already kind of did. And we'll take a look at things like arrow functions. And then after that, with whatever time we have left, I will field questions for labs and stuff like that, and we'll see if we can help get you a little further in your labs. All right? Be back here at 5:26. Like, motor through and try to get the next part done. So we have at least 20, 30 minutes so that I can help you with any lab stuff that you need help with or whatever. Just because you guys kind of get shafted a little bit due to the fact that you're on a Tuesday and there's a class before you and a class after you, so I can't really do one-on-one. That being said, though, many of you are taking advantage of the Slack thing, and is it working? Like, do you think it works? It's not as good as face-to-face, but I respond pretty quickly. Yeah. Mostly because I have no life. So I'm always home. All right. Let's go to week 5 real fast. And we'll pull down the next example. Weekly learning. Week 5 functions. Fun functions. Anybody started watching fun functions? It's pretty entertaining. Who called me sir? Ugh. It's like being called professor. I always get, hello, professor. I am not a professor. I am not published. You don't want to read anything I've written. It's all bad.
Okay, Mr. Sean.
Mr. Sean. Open. Let's open those up after you've unzipped them. And it's the custom functions. For some reason, it opened in a completely new instance of Sublime, but whatever. I will accept it. Incidentally, I kind of went a little haywire with this. That's why there is a main backup.js. And I left it there. The reason why I left it there is because sometimes to see my thought process will help you learn new things. So there's my thought process. We were going to look at promises. We were going to look at async and await. This is some pretty heavy-duty stuff. Scaled that way the hell down. And now we're doing just normal stuff. Which is probably a good thing, because I really would like to be able to support you on your labs. So let's see if we can knock this out in the next half hour, 45 minutes. That was an interesting noise. Alrighty, harnessing elements. Let's grab something from the page. So I'm not just grabbing these random things that you might be like, these query selectors you're doing, these query selections, what the hell are you doing? Like, what is this stuff coming from? I'm going to show you. We're going to put index.html over to this side here. And I want you to tell me where I grabbed this element from. All right. Const. What does const mean? Constant. All right. Thing result. What is thing result? Just a variable name. That's it. People get hung up on like things like that. It's kind of funny. That's why I try to use variable names that are not keywords, because people get hung up thinking it's a keyword, and then I get my code back at me because people give me the same variable names thinking it's like a verbatim thing. Anyways, query selector. What does query selector do? Select shit, right? Select stuff on the page. I'll just answer that for you. All right. Where does this come from? I want you to tell me in the HTML what line this comes from. So thing result, where am I getting that from? 28. Did I make it up? No, exactly. I got it from line 28. What am I pulling back into my JavaScript file?
The ID.
Yes, I am pulling the ID, but what's coming with it? It's attached to something.
The section.
The section, exactly. I'm pulling back the section. So next week we're going to talk about events and DOM, like 100%. So this will be like, oh, wow, okay. But I kind of want to just keep pushing this every single week so you grasp what we're doing. This thing that comes back is actually called an HTML element. Like, that's literally in JavaScript what it's called. We look at it, it's called an instance of HTML element, which is an object. Right? You have classes. You guys have made classes before. Not classes as in CSS classes, but classes, like object classes, right? That's what this is. It's pulling back the HTML element object. It's an instance object. And on that object, what do objects have? They have two major things that you guys rely on. Content. That's true. Content would be like a vague way of describing these two things. If I want to describe my object, they're always known as what? Properties, exactly. And if I want to create actions on my object, they're what? Methods. Close enough. Methods and functions, whatever. The point is, though, is that objects are very powerful. If you really want to look at objects and you want to talk about methods and properties, at the end of the day, all of these things is variables and functions under a global namespace. That's really all it is. An object just gives us the ability to namespace these things. It allows us to be able to say, hey, I want to put these under certain types of visibility, right? I want them only to be visible to other objects. I only want them to be visible to objects that inherit from them. I only want them to be visible by itself, right? But at the end of the day, those classes we built, all they're doing is they're a namespace. They encapsulate a bunch of stuff so we don't wind up with naming collisions. This namespace that we're getting back is called an HTML element. and we are going to store it inside thing results. And that's going to give us access to a bunch of different properties on that element and a bunch of different methods on that element that are provided by the JavaScript API. It wraps it for us. Some of those properties are events, such as onClick, onInput, onBlur, onScroll. We get those. Some of them are things like offset left that we just saw. That's a property that's available to us, right? Some of them are functions that are available, like for each, things like that. We get a lot of very cool capabilities of these things. Understanding what document.query selector is returning is essential to being able to manipulate the DOM. Because if you can't grab an element off the DOM, then you're screwed. Because what are you going to manipulate, right? I mean, you could create all the elements if you wanted to, but that would be tedious. So we're going to create a function using the standard functional syntax in JavaScript. Function, we're going to call this a ludicrous name, norm func syntax. I did have it called Mark and the Funk, but then I pulled it out. Put the dick down. Param1. That's just a parameter, right? Everybody knows the difference between parameters and arguments. Parameters are in your definition. Arguments are the things you pass to the function, right? Never mind, whatever. Param2. If you're watching Scott's videos, he tells you they're interchangeable. They are not. But that's fine. Some people think that. Some people think they're interchangeable. And then we're going to have a default param. So the first two parameters, are these required or can we leave them empty? They're required, right? We have to fill them. When we call a function, we fill those pieces in. Now in JavaScript, it's a little bit more looser than that, and I'll show you that in a second. But if I want to provide a default parameter, right? A default parameter is, hey, make sure you have parameter 1 and 2, but parameter 3 is optional. I will autofill it with something. If you don't pass in an argument to it, that's totally cool, because I'll just use my default value. And if I want to do that, I just I give it a name, and then I give it a value. So I'm going to say default parameter value, like so. I'm just going to make sure I open up my index file over here, because I still haven't done that. So I'm going to go to open file. I should work in like darker backgrounds, because that is really bright. It is so bright. It brightens up the whole class. There we go.
Because otherwise you can't even see the keyboard.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because you don't have backlighting.
Yeah.
Cheapskate. Norm. Please don't tell on me. Norm func syntax. So what am I missing? I've got my function definition almost. What am I missing? Yeah, I need the block, right? That's what those curly braces are. They're blocks. Remember I showed you guys in week 1 the iffy, and you all kind of looked at me really confused? Iffies are done. We don't need iffies anymore. The purpose of an iffy was to basically scope information to a block. So everybody's writing these iffies everywhere. And they're confusing. They don't really make a lot of sense. They don't have a symbol name. They're kind of bizarre looking. We don't need those anymore. We can actually write code like this. Let's just shove this thing to the bottom. There we go. Refresh. I still work. Yay. Block. No for loops, no functions, nothing. Just empty block. That's available to you in C++. So why isn't it available in every other language that exists that inherits from C++? Right? Makes sense to me? So we don't need iffies. If we want to scope stuff, we can literally just write an empty block like that. Anyways, that was a bit of a tangent. I'm going to wipe that out. Inside our norm func, let's just console.log some stuff out. We'll console log param1, param2, and the default param. And then we might as well call them, right? So we'll do norm func syntax. And I'm absolutely required, actually, can't remember, I don't think I am Yeah, I'm not required to give it the arguments. The problem is, when I go to access those arguments here, it'll blow up because they're undefined, right? So I'll get a reference error. So I am required to pass them because my logic inside the function requires them. So I'm going to pass in argument 1, argument 2, and I'm not going to pass argument 3. Right? Will it blow up? Nope. Why won't it blow up, Ali?
Because you have the default already set.
That's exactly it. Because I have the default, it's not going to blow up. If I hit click refresh, I get argument 1, argument 2, default parameter value. But the cool thing about this is I can actually override it if I want to. So I'm just going to duplicate that line. And then I'm going to pass in override value. And if I refresh, there we go. Now I get argument 1, argument 2, and the overridden value. When we take a look at prototypes and objects after the break, when we start looking at that, we're going to look at a better way to clean this up. Because I kind of have a rule that if I write more than 3 arguments into a function, I fix that. I make it accept an array, or I make it accept a dictionary. Right? You guys call them dictionaries and lists. I call them structs or objects. So that I can pass it the parameters that I want. Right? So I don't need a big laundry list of arguments. I don't need the person to know the order of the parameters, because that's always annoying, right? How many times have you goofed up just even 2 parameters, the order of 2 parameters, right? In PHP, it happens all the time because those jackasses can't seem to straighten the order of parameters between 2 functions that basically do the same thing. They don't maintain their own consistency, right? So to me, having options is really fantastic because then you can guarantee that the user doesn't have to know the order. They just have to know what options are available, right? Anyways, let's move on. Step 1B. Well, this was supposed to be step 1B, so I'll just move that down. Step 2. Using the standard function syntax, create an operation for the thing1 button to execute. Yay, event binding. So let's do that. So function thing1 action. Badonk. And all we're going to do is return thing result dot text content. I'm just going to move this down a little bit. Move down. There we go. So you can see what happens. Result equals thing1 says I have done a thing. Makes sense? And then next, of course, I want to call our function, which is simply just invoking the action, right? And when I save it and refresh, it spits up on the screen. Now, I have not bound this to the buttons yet. I've saved all the binding to the end, just in case we run out of time. Because we'll be doing binding next week. So that's cool. Now the thing in JavaScript, and it is available in other languages. PHP supports anonymous functions. Ruby supports. Now Ruby doesn't support anonymous functions, but it supports blocks, which are kind of the same thing. Anyways, in JavaScript, we support something called anonymous functions. Anonymous functions are literally a function with no name, right? That's all it is. Let's create one. Const anon func syntax equals. Here's our anonymous function. Function param1, param2 equals anonymous. Give it some curly brackets. Console.log, param1, param2. This is an anonymous function. The function has no name, and I'm just assigning it to a variable, right? But now I can use the variable to call the function. What is happening under the hood is this functional expression, this definition here, gets assigned to anon func syntax. And I can demonstrate that if I refresh my browser here, and in my console I type in anon func, and you can see it already fills it out. And I don't add any parentheses to this. And I hit enter, it spits out the literal function definition. Right? Second I add parentheses, it executes it. Right? So I can do that as well. Add the parentheses. It should blow up because we're trying to access variables that don't exist. Now I get undefined. Right? I get undefined. It doesn't blow up. Good job, JavaScript, making a fool out of me. All right, now let's call this thing. To call it, we just call the JavaScript or the variable name, and we add some parentheses. We'll say we are. Refresh over here, and we get we are anonymous. Anonymous. Don't worry, it gets better. Let's do it again. A non-func syntax, only this time we're going to provide it. We are, comma, Venom. We are Venom. I'm going to see that on Saturday. Very excited. I'm a big nerd. All right. Step 4. Using the anonymous function syntax, create an operation for thing2 button to execute. Okay, that sounds fun. Const thing2 action equals function, right? No name. Bonk. Thing result dot text content equals thing2 says I have done a thing. There we go. They're all going to say that. You can copy and paste if you want. And then let's call it thing2 action. Now if I refresh, it'll say thing2 says I have done a thing, which means our function is working. How many of you have seen anonymous functions before? Yeah? So for the rest, it's kind of new. Okay, well, I'm going to introduce something that's very likely new to every single person in this room, unless you are a JavaScript 6 programmer. It's called the arrow function. This will break your brain a little bit. Const arrow func syntax equals no function keyword. The parameter list in parentheses. I'm going to pass it param1, param2, and make it equal to awesome. Somehow, I need to give it a block so it knows what to execute. So I use the arrow function. I call it a fat arrow. That's probably from CoffeeScript because they code in CoffeeScript so much. We call those fat arrows. If it's the dash and the arrow, I call it a thin arrow. Just, I don't know. It's being insensitive to programming, I guess. Console.log, param1, param2. I'm body shaming arrow functions. There we go. That's unique. A lot of people aren't used to that, but it's not really that complex. In PHP, right, you guys have used arrows in PHP before when you define a list, right, because everything's a bloody array, but they're actually technically all lists. They're just indexed, some are indexed, some aren't, but they're the same object, they don't change. When you define that array, list, what dictionary, whatever you want to call it, you give it an index, name, key, whatever, then it's arrow and whatever the thing is, right? That's very common. Arrows are also used quite heavily in Ruby. They're used quite heavily in things like pre-processing languages because they're unique and they don't show up in every language. Some languages use them to be able to call off actions and stuff. This is essentially what's occurring. We're giving a parameter list, and then we're passing those values into the block. Does anybody know what that syntax structure is called? It's with an L. Yeah, it's a lambda. It's called a lambda. And you'll see lambdas. A lot of languages support lambdas. Some are a lot easier to do than some others. Ruby, it's really easy to do lambdas. And JavaScript, pretty simple. In C++, not so simple. Anyways, if we execute this, it's not going to do anything because we need to call it. And calling it, you just call the same way you would call any other function. Arrow func syntax. I'm going to write arrow functions are, and then refresh. Arrow functions are awesome. Cool. Some of you may disagree. So arrow functions, that's the long way of writing them. We can write them shorter than that. Const arrow func2. I'm going to write in param1, param2, give it a default value of sweet. And if I only have one line of syntax to evaluate and execute, I can literally type it right after. Console.log, param1, param2. And incidentally, it immediately returns that line. So you don't even need to add the word return in front of it if you're just returning back a value. If that's all it's going to do, you just write the value. I mean, that's a single line function. Like, not many languages support single line functions. Right? We get single line if conditions, now we have single line functions. If we refresh, oh, we didn't call it. Helps if we call it. Arrow func2, and then refresh. Sweet. Oh, we didn't give it a definition. Let's give it something. Arrow functions are, refresh. There we go. Arrow functions are sweet. Just out of curiosity, anybody seen arrow functions before? Cool. Both versions, short and long?
I think like once each.
Yeah. They're fantastic at shortening up code. There is an issue with those arrow functions. Does anybody know what the issue is? Are they cross-browser compliant? To an extent. To what year? From what year to what year? This year to what year? 2018 to 2016. Because ES6, that's when they were introduced, which means you have a 2-year gap to use those functions in. There's this very cool thing called Babel. Babel allows us to take all this wonderful code. We go to our browser. Now, granted, you won't want to use Babel this way all the time. It's better to use it with something like Webpack, or there's a whole bunch of other things. Anyways, you can do it this way. You go to babeljs.io. We'll go to try it out. The internet is really slow here today. I don't know. Really? We'll just let that load in the background there. Anyways, we take our code and we paste it into the Babel transpiler. The Babel transpiler will transpile our code to whatever version of JavaScript we want to utilize. So if you're writing code for, God forbid, ES6, or sorry, not ES6, but Internet Explorer 6, which you shouldn't be doing. And if you are, you should be charging hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that. But if you are, you can run it in Babel. Babel will transpile it into JavaScript that Internet Explorer 6 understands, which means you can use ES6 today. You can use ES7 and ES8. So you can use the latest version of JavaScript, and then when you're done creating your code, take that code, run it through Babel, and let it transpile it out to something the browsers will all understand, which is pretty cool. Good job, Babel. You just keep loading. All right, we'll show that later once it's done. Step 6, using the arrow function syntax, create an operation for the thing3 button to execute. All right, so const thing3 action equals empty parentheses, because you don't have to have parameters if you don't want them. And we'll do it in one line. Thing result dot text content is equal to thing3 says I have done a thing. And then we call it thing3 action. If I refresh, there we go. Thing 3 says I have done a thing. Callbacks. Probably one of the most essential, fundamental things to understand in JavaScript. Understanding callbacks will allow you to be very successful with JavaScript. Not just JavaScript. I use callbacks in PHP as well. We wrote a framework called Sparky where I work. And Sparky is essentially Ruby on Rails in PHP, so PHP isn't so unbearable. So we wrote this framework. I wrote a rendering engine. I wrote a whole bunch of different things. The rendering engine uses a ton of callbacks, which is important because I use a pre-processing language called Haml. And Haml, essentially what Haml is it's HTML, but instead of having nested elements, you use tab delimited to express nesting. And it's really cool too because you can actually input like PHP in line with your Haml, and it will execute it in line. You don't need opening and closing tags in a bajillion places. It just parses it. So it makes it very, very powerful. In order to make it even more powerful, though, I use callbacks so I can capture blocks of data and turn it into inline editable content. Callbacks are very handy. Callbacks allow you to move data between a function within scope, right? So we're going to kind of demonstrate that. They're one of those things that you just eventually get. I hate to say it, but it is. It's one of those things that you just eventually understand, and you work with them well. To that point, it can be something that will trip you up quite a bit. So the first thing, why don't we create a function called output, and we'll use our new very cool arrow function so we can do it all in one line. It'll just allow us to target the thing result. Anybody not like arrow functions? No? Yeah, they're pretty cool. They're slick. I find them very, very slick. All right. Create a function that takes a callback parameter. So the way callbacks work essentially is either you have them as a part of the function that allows you to call the function at a specific point. And we pass it as a parameter. What essentially will happen is we can pass our function right here and then call it anywhere within our script at any time we're ready to call it. Remember, I talked to you guys and told you that JavaScript is asynchronous, right? So you can see the power of this. Because of asynchronicity, you can't guarantee things are happening when you're expecting them to. Callbacks allow us to fire off specific chunks of content at specific points when we're ready to. Okay? Callbacks are not gone, though they are used a lot less. We tend to use things like promises and async await and stuff like that to do these things now, but it's very important to understand callbacks, especially when you're dealing with other people's code, especially legacy code, right? Because you'll see callbacks everywhere because of the asynchronous nature of JavaScript. Callbacks get abused heavily because many new programmers want to force JavaScript to be synchronous. That's like the first thing they do. Learn how to make JavaScript synchronous. And they just try to force it into this mold. But JavaScript works better when it's allowed to be asynchronous. There are specific points when you need to use callbacks, and then there's times where you just let JavaScript do its thing. Okay? And learning to identify those moments will help you to be a better JavaScript programmer. All right, so let's do the callback. So we're going to call it callback param, and we're going to give it an argument. Callbacks are magic. There we go. Bunk, bunk. Step 7b, call the function, passing output in as the argument. Only the function definition is passed. So we can pass an argument in two different ways. We can either pass the function and call it. If we do that, there's no point. That is not a callback, because essentially all we're doing, what happens when we call the function in that scenario? What will be happening? Does anybody know? Order of operations. Remember order of operations. If I pass a function with parentheses in here, it's going to call that function. and then the value of that function will be inside this block, and that will get passed in. That's not what I want, though. I want to be able to pass the function in and then call it at a specific point. So I need to make sure I only pass the function definition. So what do I need to drop off the function? The parentheses, exactly. So we'll do that. So we're going to do CB func syntax. And I want to pass it output, so I'm only going to pass the word output. Right? So now I'm taking this wonderful arrow function we created, and I'm just passing its definition into CB func syntax. And we can see that. We'll write a couple of console logs real fast. Function call. We'll call it. Need to wrap that. Oh, I see. Never mind. I see what I did. Doop. There we go. Call it. And then we'll do it without the parentheses. And call that definition. So on line 89, I'm actually invoking the output. On line 90, I am simply passing the definition to console.log. And if I refresh, we can see our function call says undefined, and that makes sense because we didn't give it a parameter. So it's console logging nothing. And then the function definition is showing us the actual expression that we typed on line 75. Right? Anybody still having confusion with definition and call between those two? We'll use them quite a bit, so hopefully they'll become cleaner. I'm going to just comment those out. The rest of our code is working okay. You should see, if you comment those out, callbacks are magic. Step 7c, call the function passing an anonymous function as the argument that provides a parameter to be filled by the calling function. So not only can we pass function definitions to it, we can actually use those very cool anonymous functions right in line. I don't need to create a function outside if all I'm really trying to do is execute a callback. I can pass it immediately inside the expression. So I can say CB func syntax, and then write my function definition right here. Function. Like so. You've seen this probably a bajillion times now when we pass anonymous functions to for each, or when we pass it to map, filter, any of those, right? I'm going to say this is the passed arg, and then I'm going to output the passed arg. If I refresh, you're going to see callbacks are magic still. Nothing got overwritten. And the reason is, get ready for a bit of a mind break. We have our function. This is our callback definition, right? Here, we are invoking our function and passing it an argument. When we write this, we're essentially templating this over top of this expression, which means the passed arg is what value? Sorry? Yep. Close. It's what's currently being passed to the callback param. I kind of saw it. That was my moment too. The same expression on your faces was the moment that I was like, what you just said right now doesn't make any sense, little kid. Like, what are you saying to me? This is terrible. I'll go through it again. Callback param, that's the function definition. Okay, that's the expression we wrote, right? Our function definition is output. It takes a parameter of message, okay? This parameter that we pass into it is what we want to pass as an argument to output, okay? When we call it as an anonymous function here, whatever we pass in here gets immediately passed to there. I'm going to write a flowchart, and I'm going to post it for you, showing exactly what happens to that argument so that you can better understand what is occurring. Otherwise, this is complete magic for most people. It becomes very, very confusing. But save it to say, we're able to call output. I have another piece. Step 8, using the callback function syntax, create an operation for thing4 button to execute. Okay, so const thing4 action is equal to function callback. Callback is the function, now we're executing it, right? And we're going to say thing4 says I have done a thing. Dot, dot, dot. Step 8a, call the function using an anonymous function as a callback. All right, so thing4 action. First, I want to create the anonymous function, so function. Whenever I write these, I always write out the syntax block like that. That's the first thing I do. Then I hit enter. I want to capture this. I need to be able to have access to that. And the only way I'm going to be able to have access to that is by providing an argument to my anonymous function. I'm going to call it message. Okay. Actually, you know what? I'm going to make this way easier. I'm going to call it thing4 says I have done thing. There we go. That's what I'm going to call it. Because I am passing an argument, it will fill this parameter for me. And then I have access to that thing, so I'm just going to go thing result dot text content is equal to thing4 says I have done a thing. If I refresh, you can see it spits it out. The anonymous function is instantly executed. Yeah, instead of using message, so it's a little clearer. This thing comes from this thing. These things are connected. Yeah, man.
So in thing4 action,
Yep.
callback, is callback being passed into thing4 action? Nope. Is that being passed as thing4 says I've done a thing?
So the callback
Yeah,
is the functional definition.
right.
That's what we're passing in there right now. So right now, callback is the function definition, and that is it. It is literally that syntax that's getting passed into there right now.
Okay, that is callback.
Yeah, that is callback. If you look at it, thing4 action is a function, right? You know what? Why don't we write this in a way that's probably a little bit easier to look at? We won't parse it, but thing4 action, callback, function, callback, function, and then this thing. Actually, I'm just going to say argument. Okay. When I pass my function definition, that's what is getting passed. This whole thing here is getting passed into there. And we can see that. If I do a console.log inside here, callback function, like so. I'm just going to comment this out so we don't wind up with symbol collisions. I'm going to refresh. See? There's our function definition. Our function definition is literally parentheses, the thing4 says I have done a thing. Curly braces, thing result.text content equals thing4 says I have done a thing. That's what's getting passed into thing4 action. Because that's passed, I'm able to call it by just adding a set of parentheses to the end of it and give it an argument, whatever argument I want. That argument, when I do that, it fills that requirement of thing4 says I have done a thing. Now I have access to it, and I can call it out.
Right. Okay, That
Wow,
makes
the light
sense.
bulb just went on.
It
Yeah, how many people kind of grasp that? How many people are like, fuck no? Yeah, a good chunk of you? Okay. We're going to do this more and more next week because when we do event binding, we use callbacks a bajillion times, right? So understanding it, this is kind of higher level. We're going to understand it at a lower level next week, and I promise you I will bring you a flow chart of how it works so that it's a little better to understand. The cool thing about callbacks is they are available in other languages. They are not just a JavaScript thing. Like you can do callbacks inside PHP. You can do callbacks in other languages. A lot of languages call them lambdas, right? Because that's essentially a lambda. Yeah.
Can you tell the live example when you were using the callback and how it was working for you and how it was helpful?
How I did it? You want to see render?
What the example when you were using real life?
Oh, in this? Yeah, you use it all the time when you do in JavaScript. You want to see it in JavaScript?
Yeah, how did you use it before in your work experience? How did you use it? How did it help you with benefits?
It's a good example to show. Pine Ridge might be. Pine Ridge might be the better one to show. Let's see. By the way, this is probably the worst contact form you've ever seen in your life. This is not how big it is. It is this big. Yeah. So callback functions. These handy little things here are currently running in a callback function. So this guy's requirement, he did not want date pickers. He doesn't like date pickers. He's very old school baby boomer, right? I want drop downs because drop downs are what look better and people like drop downs. Yeah, this code became immensely harder because of drop downs. Because now one drop down needs to rely on another. And in order to do that, we have to do callbacks. When I choose a number in here, it triggers an event which fires off the callback and all of the other pieces and changes the numbers that are available. So now only the available dates within that time period are available. Notice how the last four are grayed out. If I choose another one, now the times limit themselves up based on the times that are available on that date range. Yeah, it's hell. There's about 200 lines of code there that execute every single time. Yeah, could definitely be tightened up, needs refactoring, but my boss doesn't like paying for refactoring. So it's very prototypal, and we've broken it I don't know how many times. But yeah, and those are all callbacks, right? Callbacks you use all the time with event binding. Anytime you do anything like this, you need a callback because that's the only way to execute the event. Because you can't guarantee when the event is going to occur. So for example, and I'm actually going to show you an example. We have an example right now. Using thing 1, 2, 3, and 4 actions, bind the functions to our events. When we click these buttons, we have no idea when the user is going to click them, right? So we need to be able to fire off or execute something when they click the button. Those are callbacks, right? Let me show you an example. First, let's grab all the buttons. Let's just grab one button for now, just because I don't want to run out of time. So we'll do thing 1 button, which is on your HTML if you look at it. Document.query selector. Oh, that spit itself out really fast. Hashtag button thing 1. Okay. And then we'll bind an event to it. We've already created the callback. So let's pass it. So we'll do thing 1 button dot add event listener. Okay, so event listener is the function, right? Just like we've created functions above, add event listener is a function that exists. It's a method that's available on thing 1 button. Add event listener, what it does is it will actually execute everything it needs to do. It applies the event to the button, and then it sets a callback function. The only thing we need to provide to this, the two things we need is 1, the event. I'm going to use click, right? Makes sense for a button. Could use on mouse over or something like that. Sorry, not on mouse over, just mouse over if you wanted to. Comma. And then our callback. And we have one already. We have thing 1 action. Okay? If I refresh my page, if I click thing 1, notice the text says thing 1 says I have done a thing. It changes. This is very important because when this event occurs, there's no way for JavaScript to know when to execute that function unless we were to pass it as a callback. We're saying, hey, this is the time that you're going to execute it at. By passing it the function definition, it's a little more efficient than if we were to run it as an anonymous function. But we can. So let's change this so that it uses an anonymous function. So now we have function, just an anonymous function. And I'm going to call the same thing, thing1 button action, but this time I'm going to call it with the parentheses. Okay, so it's in an anonymous function, and I'm just going to spit it right out. I'm going to refresh my page, click thing1, and it does the same execution. But now it's a little slower, right? Why is it a little slower? Pardon? Yeah, exactly. It has to go through 2 scopes then. We don't start at that scope. We have to actually move through the function scope and then to the next. Now, granted, it's marginalized, right? Like you're talking like fractions of a nanosecond. Like it's not really a big deal. But if you add that up, you have tons of these things doing it, then you want to try to make it more efficient. But either way, that still works. We can also use the arrow function version of this. The arrow function. Do you want me to keep deleting this out, or is that okay? You guys are cool with that? All right. So we can do the same thing, only this time we're going to pass an arrow function. The arrow function looks like this. That's how the arrow function looks. I refresh, click thing1. Oh, maybe I do have to execute it. I don't think it's going to work with just the function definition. There we go. In that scenario, you have to execute it. You can't just pass the function definition to it. So callbacks are extremely important because they allow us to time things. With event listeners, yes, we can't control when the user is actually going to commit an event, right? So we definitely need callbacks to fire off in order to execute some sort of expression when they actually do that event. Where these come in a lot more handier is API calls. API calls are atrocious. You have no idea when Buddy's server is going to return a response. You can't know, but you know that you need to execute something when it does. The only way to do that is by using a callback function, because the callback function will get called once it's done its execution. Right? Is that a little clear? Maybe a fraction clear? Again, I will come armed with an application flowchart to show you how the callback parameters and arguments work and what happens in those scenarios. They are a bit to wrap your head around, and we're going to do it a lot of times. So don't feel nervous that you don't understand it. Okay? All right. That being said, there are several different places that you can obviously view. So MDN, if you look up callbacks, callback function under the MDN. They walk you through what callbacks are. They talk about different pieces of callbacks. They use standard syntax for functions. Very handy place. There's also fun function. That guy's hilarious, and it's worthwhile watching his videos. But he talks about callback functions, and not to mention a bajillion other places in Google talk about callback functions. I will post some of the better links. This is not going to work. All right. Goodbye, bane of my existence. Okay, we are at 6:16. I'm just going to close these off. I'm going to leave it recording for now. I did write a bit of a list. For those of you that are having no issue with your lab or assignment and don't require any extra help, you're welcome to dodge out early on a Tuesday. Okay? For those of you that are having issues with your labs or assignments and require some extra help, I recommend staying. I'm going to talk about a few pieces that are showing up, such as accessing elements on the DOM, which you need to do for your assignment, creating elements with JavaScript, so actually how to create a DOM element inside the HTML, nested loops, because that seems to throw people. Did you guys never do nested loops in Intro to Programming? No? Yeah? Lots? Okay, seems to be still a thing though. While loops with an array length condition, which might be new, so you actually use the array length as a condition, and then destructuring. Okay, so that should hopefully cover most of what you're missing. Next week, I might. How many of you would benefit from like 45 minutes of CSS next week? No? How many people need 45 minutes of CSS? Okay, so I might do you a grand favor, and this is very big. I might record a 45-minute video and just post it to YouTube. Okay? Okay. All right. Yeah, let's do this. So I'm going to open up a new window for me. Those of you that are cool, you're welcome to Jet. All right, accessing elements in the DOM. Okay, we definitely want to be able to access elements in the DOM. Let's start with this page, actually. I'm going to open this up. Come on, Sublime, play nice. File. Why is it doing that? Open recent. I got it. All right, there we go. We'll move this index over here. Gets a little dark in here. I'm just going to change this to JavaScript real fast. There we go. The HTML DOM structure, right, the document object model, is everything from it's actually even outside of that doc type. It's the whole window, right? But the things we really concern ourselves with are the stuff inside the HTML part. In order to access those, we need to have things to be able to access them with. There's a bunch of different ones that are available to you. The ones we've been using currently are from ES5, which are available from 2015 on, right? I feel like supporting 2015 on in this, like currently in this day with all browsers basically updating themselves since 2015 is perfectly fine. Supporting browsers older than 2015, I know in our business, like where I work, we charge extra. We actually charge a premium of almost double for any support on any browser older than 2015 if you require it. Because it costs a lot more to maintain, it's a lot harder to develop, it takes a lot more time. So we charge a premium. We don't support IE 10 at all. We dropped support for IE 10 a while back.
You have to write it in code that browser understands?
Yeah, exactly. So you have to do browser detection, write code that the browser understands specifically for that stupid browser. Same with CSS, right? Like supporting CSS for browsers like that, that's annoying because now you're supporting browsers that just need to catch up. That's really what needs to happen. They need to catch up. So it kind of forces, plus it's kind of forcing Microsoft to adopt web standards and abide by web standards because they were fighting everybody before this. All right, so there's elements on the page here. Say I want to select the body element and I want to store the body element. And this shows up several times inside your lab and inside your assignment. It says, I believe it says, select element with ID blah and store it. What I mean in that scenario is create a variable, either a const, let, or var. It's totally up to you. Const is more powerful than let or var in this scenario because you're never changing it. So it's more efficient, right? Because it only allocates the amount of memory it requires exactly for that thing. If you use let because you can mutate it, it will literally allocate however much memory is necessary. And then it will copy and destroy repeatedly, which makes it a lot less efficient. So we're going to use const. Why don't we grab the body? So we'll just say const body. Body is just the name I gave it. You can call it whatever you want. Bob's body, whatever. And then to access it, I have a few different options, but the one we've been using is Query Selector, which is a method built on document. Document.querySelector. And then what goes between these apostrophes, quotes, single quotes. Wow. I'm in a lot of pain. I'm dealing with like a bad wisdom tooth, and it's really annoying. It's distracting. Anyways, what goes between those quote characters is your selector. And you're using CSS selectors, right? So if I want to select a class in CSS, say a class on an object, What is the syntax? It's in and the class name.
No, hash
Dot.
is
Not
ID.
hash. How many people say hash?
No, that's ID.
No, it's dot. Exactly. Hash is ID. So it's hash if it's an ID. It's dot if it's a class. What if it's a tag?
Nothing.
Nothing. We just call body, right? That grabs our body element off the page. We now have access to the body element inside that document. That's going to return back a thing called an HTML element. That HTML element has a whole bunch of stuff on it, including events that we can actually trigger, right? Okay, let's do another one. Let's grab the header on the page. The header has class Jumbotron. So this time I want to grab it by the Jumbotron class. So I'm going to call it const header for my variable name. What is my syntax? Document.query selector, single quotes, and I want to grab it by the class. Dot Jumbotron, exactly. There we go. Now we have the header element. Let's do one more. Let's grab one of the buttons this time.
Why don't you need the my5?
If you want to narrow it down, you can definitely add it. Like this is just a CSS selector, so you could do my5, right? Sorry, my-5, and that would narrow it down even further. But by doing it by dot Jumbotron, it will just grab, that's the only element I have on the page, so it will grab that one. Incidentally, query selector, how many elements does it return?
Just the one, the
Just
first
one.
one it finds.
Exactly. Only the first instance of what it finds, right? Here, let's do an interesting one. I want to select, because I believe this is part of the assignment, I want to select all the buttons on the page. Every single button. Let's do const buttons equals, I'll start it out for you,
Query selector all.
query selector all. Query selector all will return an array of HTML elements that match your selector. Okay? So obviously I'll give it button, right? Because ID is too specific. What if I only select, what if I was to do button thing 1? What would be my returned value?
You would only get button thing 1, because unless there's more than one button thing 1.
You're right. I would only get button thing 1, but what structure would it be in?
Don't we need a hash?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. You would need a hash. It would be in an array structure because query selector all, regardless of if it's one element or 90 elements or no elements, will always return an array. Always. So that's a gotcha that you got to pay attention to, because if you do query selector all and call back the button thing and expect you only have one element and then try to call a method on it, it'll likely blow up and tell you it will not work on a collection of HTML elements. Okay? So that's an important thing to understand. Let's change that back to button. So that's cool. So now we have all of our buttons, right? If I want to create an element on the page, first what I'm going to do is I have my selected element. I'm going to append something to the body. So I'm going to create the element first. So I'm going to say let my new element equal, and it's called on document. Does anybody know what it's called to create a new element? Create element. There we go. Cool. What is the argument that I pass it? Yes, the HTML tag. So let's create a div. I'm not done. I want to do some things with this, right? So in your labs and in your assignments, I tell you to add classes, right? I tell you to change text content. I tell you to set attributes, right? All of these can be done on this new element. This new element that we're looking at is actually called a document fragment. What that means is that it's not a part of the DOM yet. It just exists on its own in virtual memory, right? It's just sitting there in memory. It's not actually a part of the DOM. We haven't added it to anything. We haven't appended it to anything. It's in flux, right? I love that word, flux. It's in flux. So we're going to say my new element, and I want to add a class to it. Does anybody know the syntax for adding a class? So that's Jquery. It's class list is the first part. Class list will actually give you a list of all the classes that are currently attached on the element as an array, okay? But we can also call the next method on it, dot add. Add is literally add a class. You can actually provide several in here. You don't need to just provide one. It will take a list of things. So class 1, class 2, class, class 3. You can provide as many as you want as long as they're strings, right? Or a variable that contains a string. And if we ran that, we would have all 3 classes attached to our myNewElement, which is a div.
Where is it going? Where is it going to create it?
I haven't done that yet. Currently, it's not created anywhere. Right now, it's just created in memory. Yeah, so this HTML fragment, this document fragment, is just sitting in memory. When we're ready, we can append it to the body. Yeah. Or in your scenario, game board, right? Because that's what you guys are doing in your assignment. So you'd want to append to the game board. All right, we're not quite done yet, though. Let's add some attributes to this thing. So attributes are these wonderful things. These are called attributes, right? Attributes are like little pieces of information about your HTML structures tag. And there's a bunch of different ones. There's a whole pile of them. There's source, there's ref, there's data tags, right? There's area tags. There's the new role tags. There's a ridiculous number of tags. There's style. There's a whole bunch of them. Those attributes, we actually have access to them. And there's a few different ways we can do them. One, we can set an attribute by calling set attribute on the element. It takes 2 arguments. Argument 1 is the name of the attribute, right? So why don't we set a data? We'll call it data thing. Whatever we want, we're going to set that attribute. And then the next piece is a value, whatever value we want to give it. My value. That will create a data attribute, right, called data thing onside the myNewElement, and assign it the value my value. Something common that you may, something died.
Yeah, the air conditioning. It's
Oi.
fucking killing me.
It's a good thing then, I guess. Anyways, something that you may want to do quite often is change your styles dynamically with JavaScript, right? There's a few different ways. You can use set attribute to change the style, but that's not the best way to do it because it's not the most direct. The easiest way to do it is to call style on your element. And then, obviously, what do you do when it's something like background dash color, right? Like, how do you write that? What you do is you remove the dash and capitalize the second word. Bit of a thing you need to know. You don't have to do that, though. You can also do this if you don't remember. You can put it in square brackets as an index. Okay, but it looks a lot better if you call it this way. It's a property, so it's not a function. It doesn't take an argument. It's a property, so you have to assign whatever it is that you want to assign to it. Hashtag, I don't know what color that is. We'll find out. Style isn't the only one that works like that. Quite often you will want to add data attributes. Data attributes are very handy for storing little pieces of information inside your tag that you can then later on access with JavaScript. For example, when you are taking cards and you're flipping over and you don't want to keep the value in the text content, you want to be able to access the value of the card that you're turning back over, I would definitely recommend using data attributes. Data attributes are very handy for that. So we do myNewElement dot dataset is the name of it. Dot and whatever you want to call the attribute. Literally whatever you want to call the attribute. Doesn't matter what it is. I'm going to call it my data key equals 95. Other attributes work like that too. I believe, I'm not 100% on it to be honest with you, but I believe you can call my new element dot ID equals Bob. Need to stop saving. I'm literally just going to copy and paste this into the browser. Save myself a lot of work. Now I'm done my element. My element is created, and I'm ready to finish up and apply it to my page. So, what is the key method I want to use to apply it? I want to add it to the body. Does anybody know the syntax? What's that? By document? Oh, document.write? Document.write, I do believe, will allow you to write HTML directly to the document. However, it's not quite the quickest way for us to do it. What we can do instead is take the HTML element that we selected already, which is body. We can call .append or append child. Either one will work. You also have prepend. Okay. Difference between append and prepend is append will drop it to the bottom, prepend will put it to the top, right? Append, and then we just do my new element. I need to stop saving. It's a good habit, but it's also annoying when you're trying to do this. I save like every line. Gotten in a very good habit of saving every line. Happens when you lose a whole bunch of work.
I was just gonna say, did you lose work?
I have, yeah, in the past I have. All right, I'm going to just copy this. I'm going to open up this wonderful console. I'm going to clear it. You can do that in two ways. Either click the little clear button or Command K if you're on a Mac. I don't know where it is in Windows. Control something or no?
Right there.
I'm going to paste all that stuff inside there. So what do? We grab the body, we grab the header, we grab the buttons. We created a new element. We applied 3 new classes to that element. We set an attribute called data thing. We set a style of the background color 1234EFE. We set my new element.dataset.my data key to 95, and we created an ID. And then we're going to append it to the body. Oh wait, we want to do one more thing before we do that. Let's do my new element.textContent equals hey there. We'll save that, and then we'll do it. Body.append my new element. And there it is. There's our new element that just showed up on the page. If I right-click on the element and choose to inspect it, we can see all the attributes that got added to it. Class 1, Class 2, Class 3, data thing, data-my-data-key. Now that's some magic, right? Because my data key is written in camel case. It literally broke it on every capital and applied a dash and lowercase the whole thing. It's pretty cool. I didn't actually know it did that. Our ID, right? We just went new element.id equals Bob. Sure enough, it added the attribute right there for us. Our style of background color, which turned out to be blue, which is interesting. And then the text that we added, which was hey there. So all of that created a brand new DOM element. That's fine when you're trying to create multiple dynamic elements, but you can see why we keep HTML out of JavaScript, right? That gets very cluttered, becomes very messy over time. Using templates is a lot cleaner, looks a lot nicer because it's sitting in the HTML document, right? Plus, it's a lot easier to work with, but I think this is a good demonstration of how to grab those different pieces. All right, we only have a few minutes left. How many want nested loops? How many want destructuring? Who says destructuring? Okay, who says nested loops? Okay, destructuring it is, because the rest of you don't care. Destructuring is very simple. The idea of destructuring is to provide a list of variable names to store a list of array elements. Okay, so we need an array. So let's create an array. Let Bob, he's 39, and he's true. There we go. Something doesn't like something. Oh yeah, it helps if you do my r equals. There we go. So we have an array of 3 elements, right? Now I want to assign all three of those elements to three variables. I want to assign them to a variable called name, a variable called age, and a variable called bool. To do that, I just go I provide an array on the left, and I say name, age, bool, and I make it equal to my R. Stop. Now if I console.log those, name, age, and bool, I'm going to copy those 3 lines and just paste them in here because I don't really feel like saving. Console, clear, paste. We get Bob 39 and true. That's destructuring. Essentially what destructuring does is it takes the elements from your array and assigns it off to the variable names. Now, there's a bit of a got you because if I'm correct, the number of variables has to match up to the number of elements in the array. If it doesn't, I think either it comes back as undefined or it blows up.
So something was null.
Yeah, like say you were missing one of the variable names, right? Or the person passed you an element, or the array that you were passing had more elements than you were expecting, right? So this is that scenario. The array that's being passed has more elements than what we're expecting. We don't have enough variables to take all of those elements. We get a reference error. That's exactly what happens. So it blows up in that scenario. Now, if I'm correct, the opposite does work though. If I say bool and remove the value from the array, bool should just be undefined. It shouldn't blow up at all. Yeah, exactly. It's just undefined. So you can do the reverse. Destructuring is more powerful than this when you get into objects. But for now, that's all you need to know to complete your assignment. That's it. You don't need to know anything more complex. If destructuring is still a problem, what you can do is just say, fuck destructuring, and define variables for each piece, and then assign the values to each of those pieces. That's it. Destructuring is just a cleaner way of doing it in one line, right? Nice and simple, looks simple. Maybe it's not simple. I don't know. You can kind of think of it as like 2 arrays, and you're making one array equal the other array. Is essentially what you're doing. Because if you look at it, that's exactly what it looks like. If I was to move this from here to here, right? Let's just get rid of all the extra nonsense and just look at this as one thing here. Bam, okay? There. Let's look at it that way. It's like, this is my one array, and I want to take this other array and literally just plop them into those little containers. Right? So name is a container, age is a container, bool is a container. And I am taking Bob and dropping it in the name container. I'm taking 39 and dropping it into the age container. And I'm taking true and dropping it into the bool container. As long as I have 3 variables and 3 values, they go together. No? Still no?
Okay, so the issue I have is actually the fact of the intersection of multidimensional arrays.
You can't do it. You can. Actually, I've never tried that.
And that's what I'm trying to do. It's
So you're saying instead of just true, we have like Sean, Allie, Virginia.
yes.
And then I don't know if this is possible. We're about to find out. Name 1, name 2, name 3. If this works, my God, that's awesome. No, you can't do that. So it's only one dimension that you can actually go into. You can't go into a multiple dimension. You'd have to define it and then, yeah, you would have to run multiple. Like, give me an example of where you're trying to do this.
I'm trying to do it from lab 1. I must have misunderstood the previous.
Well, let's pull up lab 1.
I believe where I'm trying to do it.
We have 3 minutes. Actually, we have 7
6A.
minutes. 6A?
Yeah. So in 6. It says create a multi-dimensional array in the structure, and then 6a is using destructuring create two new variables.
Yeah, 6 is multi-dimensional.
Using destructuring, create two new variables. Yes, I know what I just did. Create two new variables named label and value, and store the elements in TD label and value in them. Well, my grammar is terrible. That's how I'm doing it, using destructuring. So TD label and value, right, comes back from value and label, which is this guy right here, this multi-dimensional array right here, right? I'm iterating through that multi-dimensional array right here. So each time I paste into here, it's only one set, right? So the first time will be character name and character name. The second time will be alter ego and alter ego. Third time will be power and power. So I only have one set. So when I go to destructure, I'm only destructuring one little tiny array into TD value and label.
That, okay, I was misunderstanding.
Is that helpful? You want to take a picture?
I mean, yes.
Go for it. I mean, you don't have the whole code.
Doing it. It's happening.
That's fine. Take a picture.
It's going.
You want to take a picture? Take a picture. All right. I'm going to stop recording. Of course, this is also recorded.